This is Zilog and Moto, and I'm Dave, your host. Why should you care? You probably shouldn't. Because what's important here is not me, but the subject of the channel, and that's taking an in-depth look at the various games that were released for the Sega Master System and the Sega Genesis and its related peripherals. Last week, I took a look at our first game that originated from the 32X, Sega's last attempt to squeeze every little bit of juice out they could of the aging Genesis platform. And if you're curious about the 32X or Star Wars Arcade, which was the actual game that was reviewed, definitely check out last week's video. There'll be a link for it at the end of the video, so keep an eye out for that. But for now, instead of the 32X and the most recent hardware I discuss here on Zilog and Moto, instead we're going back all the way back to 1987 and the Master System for Wonder Boy. Wonder Boy is originally an arcade game developed by a company called Escape, but produced by Sega and released for Sega's System 1 arcade board in 1986. The reason why I specifically mention this is because although Wonder Boy would go on to become a successful series for Sega, with further releases in the arcades and on the Master System and the Genesis/Mega Drive still to come, the story for the original Wonder Boy is a little different. Sega had to deal with Escape that was a little different than the norm and possibly only occurred because of the time period, as I'm not sure if it would fly today. In that deal, while Sega retained the rights to the name Wonder Boy and related intellectual property, Escape retained the rights to the source code used to make the game. So, while it's altogether possible that you've never heard of Wonder Boy, if you're not a huge Sega fan, you may have heard of another series called Hudson's Adventure Island. Hudson Soft, famous for their association with the PC Engine/TurboGrafx-16, was also an NES developer and worked with Escape to clone a version of Wonder Boy to the NES, but slightly tweaked as to not run afoul of the Wonder Boy intellectual property. If you've played the first Adventure Island for the NES, then you've effectively played Wonder Boy with a slightly different level layout and edited sprites. Hudson would go on to make many more Adventure Island games, but those were their own creation and had nothing to do with the Wonder Boy series. When I first started collecting Sega games again a few years ago, I didn't know the Wonder Boy story. In fact, since it was a relatively early Master System game, coming out a year after the arcade release in 1987, I was only barely familiar with the name. But I do remember picking up this copy of Wonder Boy and looking at the screenshots at the back and being like, holy shit, that's Adventure Island. Of course, then I went to the internet to figure out the backstory and things made more sense, but seeing those screenshots for the first time and remembering playing Adventure Island on the NES with my cousin 30 years ago, it was pretty crazy. Definitely a very unusual situation. So, having said all that, is Wonder Boy truly a wonder? And how does it compare against the arcade original? Or, for that matter, its Hudson Soft back clone Adventure Island, which actually came out first, in Japan anyway. Well, let's do some old school platforming and get dangerous with a skateboard and some stone axes. But also be safe and use a helmet. But first, a closer look at the package. The usual shitty early Master System cover. As you might expect, the Japanese cover is better, and I'll go ahead and superimpose it real quick. And now back to the American/European cover. Ugh. I don't get it. I know I bitch about this every single time I do a review for one of these early Master System releases, but honestly, I mean, this looks like something an elementary school kid drew after playing with the game briefly when they were doodling in a notebook between assignments. It's just awful. I can't understand why they would think anyone would want to buy this game based on this cover. I mean, the name sounds cool, Wonder Boy, but, I mean, that's about it. Note up at the top of the cover how it mentions that the game is for 1 or 2 players. And I'll zoom in a little bit on that, just in case you couldn't see that. And it is in an alternating fashion similar to Super Mario Bros. And that's not the only way Wonder Boy is similar to Super Mario Bros., but we'll discuss that more in the actual review.
I like how it mentions that it's potentially 2 players right on the front cover. I think that's probably the only thing this cover gets right. Yeah, I know later on this sort of thing will be covered in a chart box on the back cover, but having it front and center makes it really easy for kids or parents to know it can potentially be shared. And as I've mentioned before on the channel, 2-player games weren't exactly common on any of the 8-bit consoles in 1987. As far as the case goes, this copy's in solid shape. Certainly not perfect, and as I tilt up, you can see that it's been circumcised up at the top here. But the rest of the plastic on the outer cover is intact with no tears or holes or scratches. The inner cover isn't perfect, and it looks like the spine and part possibly took some water damage. I can kind of see a little bit of wrinkling here, and if you look closely you can see a little bit of wrinkling here. But other than that, it's in great shape with no color washout or other wear and tear. Flipping over the back, and boy, that rear cover is just as exciting as the front. It's the same 2 screenshot format as all the other early Master System titles, but the screenshots do look to be of decent quality. Zoom in a little bit there. Well, not that you can see on that. This is always a problem with trying to zoom in on these shots. I would have picked a different shot for the second one, as you can see here, just due to all the empty blue screen in the background. It certainly doesn't look very interesting, even though it features the skateboard power-up, but at least the pictures aren't fuzzy or difficult to see. I do like the flavor text at the bottom. It really makes the game seem interesting with a bit of cheese thrown in. So, well, now you have to, because Tanya, the love of your life, has been kidnapped and taken to the other side of the planet. You've got to get her back, as soon as possible. Besides, she'd never forgive you if you didn't risk your life. Just full overblown, overdramatic silliness. Opening up the game, you can tell it's the American version, due to it having the manual and portrait style rather than the landscape. The cartridge label is in decent shape. I mean, there's a couple nicks here, but for the most part, it's intact and it's glued to the plastic well. And the manual, while it's not in mint condition, it's in pretty decent shape. Just a couple bends here and there. And it's a thick manual too. Like, take a look at that. This is probably one of the most impressive manuals I've seen on the Master System, aside from, say, Final Fantasy. There's a lot of stuff here. Opening it up, and this is something interesting. Immediately, literally on these first page, just about, there's a level select code, which is kind of crazy to me, but hey, why not, right? I don't know how much of a cheat it is, but it's certainly hidden unless you read the manual or searched online. After that, the controls are explained. Well, at some point here the controls are explained. And then there's lots of other information here, like, all the different people in the game, and the different items, and all the different enemies. Just lots of great information in the manual. It's very thorough, and lots of pictures and drawings and such. And finally, at the end, I almost forgot about this. There's a big chart that shows how many points everything's worth, which is not really necessary, but as this was originally an arcade game, and there is a high score to try to set. It's kind of nice information to have. Just all in all, it's a great manual. I mean, they should all be like this. Okay, enough about all that. Let's get to the game.
I've already mentioned the somewhat convoluted history of Wonder Boy and its partial ownership between Sega and Escape, and its later morphing into the original Adventure Island on the NES.
But you also can't talk about Wonder Boy without discussing Super Mario Bros. Before Wonder Boy found its way to both the SG-1000 and the Master System, it started out in the arcades in April of 1986, specifically in Japan, and then later on that year around the world. Super Mario Bros., on the other hand, debuted on the NES in Japan in September of 1985, and then later found its way into the arcades the next year. I mention all this because it's impossible to play Wonder Boy without thinking of Super Mario Bros. This isn't to say that Wonder Boy is a clone of Super Mario Bros., or some sort of copycat game. Wonder Boy is definitely its own game, and has vast differences in stylistic choices, but there are definite similarities in both titles. So much so that I'm actually somewhat surprised that Sega chose to focus on Alex Kidd in Miracle World as their big name platformer, when Wonder Boy was right there, and an arcade port to boot. I can only assume that Sega wanted to try to push Alex Kidd instead, due to it being a wholly owned property of Sega, but after playing Wonder Boy, I think you might question that decision as well. Wonder Boy is a side-scrolling platformer where you control Tom Tom, a caveman-type character, as he proceeds through 10 worlds consisting of 4 levels each to rescue his girlfriend Tina. See any similarities to Super Mario Bros. Yet? Like in Super Mario Bros., for the 4th level of each world, the music will change, indicating the boss at the end of the level. Also, not only is Wonder Boy a side-scrolling platformer, it's a unidirectional platformer, meaning that your character can only proceed through the levels moving left to right, and once an item is missed and moves off the screen to the left, you cannot go back to get it, the same as how Super Mario Bros. Is constructed. From a basic control perspective, running and jumping is handled the same way as Super Mario Bros. As well, with one button on the controller being dedicated to jumping, and another button used for running rather than walking, and when those two buttons are combined, higher jumps than normal can be achieved. Based on all that, I think you can see why it's easy to compare to the NES powerhouse that turned Nintendo into a household name. Releasing Wonder Boy instead of Alex Kidd in Miracle World earlier probably wouldn't have made much of a difference in the divide between the NES and the Master System, just due to all the other factors that led to the console war turning out the way that it did. But if a child in late 1986 was presented with both Super Mario Bros. And Wonder Boy in a comparison as to which they preferred, I wouldn't be shocked to see Wonder Boy win over more than a few of those kids. Having said that, do I honestly think that Wonder Boy is better than Super Mario Bros.? Well, that's a hard question, and while I certainly can't say that I think that in every aspect, I think the comparison is probably much tougher than most people probably give it credit for being, just due to how ever-present Super Mario Bros. Has been for the last 35 years, and because Wonder Boy is, well, Wonder Boy. A game that was arguably more successful on a different console with a facelift and a totally separate name. Let's talk about Wonder Boy itself for a bit. Being that Wonder Boy was a port of an arcade game, as you can imagine, it has pretty decent graphics for a game of its age. As is common for comparisons between NES and Master System titles, Wonder Boy looks much better on the Master System than Adventure Island on the NES. Adventure Island doesn't look bad necessarily, and it's certainly not as rough a comparison as, say, Rampage on both consoles that we covered way back in episode 13, but Wonder Boy is clearly the better looking of the two titles. Obviously the graphics are better in the original arcade version, but the Master System graphics are competent recreation. Backgrounds and sprites are very colorful, and the action on screen moves very smoothly. There is a significant issue at times with flickering that seems to relate back to the issues we've seen previously with the Master System games, where too much data on the line on the screen is moving at once will cause the flickering, but usually only small parts of the screen are affected, such as when Tom Tom is on a moving platform, and the platform itself flickers during movement. It's a blemish on the game, but it doesn't affect gameplay, and I'd much rather have the closer to the arcade graphics of the Master System version with a bit of flicker than Adventure Island, which features less colors and not nearly as detailed backgrounds. One area in which Wonder Boy separates itself from Super Mario Bros. Is in variety. Variety in backgrounds, variety of enemies, variety of items to collect, etc. There are 14 different level types in Wonder Boy. Sometimes you're in the jungle, sometimes you're on the beach, sometimes you're in a cave, etc. While you can consider the level graphics to be somewhat repetitive, if you're comparing two levels that both have the same type, the layouts are going to be considerably different, and there's enough types that you won't get bored or feel like you're doing the same thing over and over as you run, jump, and act your way through the game. As far as the enemies are concerned, while Super Mario Bros. Does have a decent variety, some are just versions of other enemies, and usually a level will just have the same 3 or 4 over and over again. Whereas in Wonder Boy, not only does the game literally have twice as many enemies in the game, you'll get a much better variety during levels, and they're all well drawn and colorful. Lastly, an area that Super Mario Bros. Series improved in over time, but was lacking in the first game, is power-ups. In Super Mario Bros., you can get a mushroom, an extra life, a flower, a coin, a star, and that's it. Wonder Boy again has about twice as many things to collect, and that's considering all the various food items as one item. Plus, Wonder Boy has a bonus concept similar to Sonic the Hedgehog, where you need to collect a doll in each level, similar to the Chaos Gems in Sonic, to get to the true final 10th world. I can safely say there's more content in Wonder Boy than Super Mario Bros. Other than all the business reasons for Super Mario Bros. Being successful and Wonder Boy not being successful, I think one thing that's key in the difference between the two games is Super Mario Bros. Has more favorable controls. I already mentioned that from a basic perspective, the controls in both games are very similar, with one button serving as a run-shot button, and the other button serving as a jump button. However, the controls in Wonder Boy play just a little bit looser, with probably a more accurate physics/inertia representation. Unfortunately, that's not necessarily what you want in a fantasy platformer, and the jumps in Super Mario Bros. Feel more pinpoint, and that the player has more precise control over where Mario goes. I think the idea, especially with Wonder Boy originally being an arcade game, was that there was a desire for Wonder Boy to be a platformer, but also play faster and have more action. Hence the skateboard is one of the power-ups. Of course, that means there's a trade-off as far as the controls are concerned, and I can definitely see why people would rather play Super Mario Bros. In that scenario. It's just a little bit more accessible. However, to counter that, Wonder Boy has one of the greatest features that could possibly be included in a long, difficult platformer, especially one released in the early 3rd generation of consoles, and that is infinite continues. Not only does Wonder Boy allow you to continue your game as many times as you like, you can continue in the middle of a world. For instance, if you get to World 2, Level 3, and lose all your lives, you can continue from that specific level, and not have to go all the way back to the beginning of the world. Beyond that, each of the levels are each split up into 4 sections, allowing for continuing during a level rather than having to redo a level entirely. These continue features instead make the player want to continue playing the game and work their way through, rather than give up on the game as being too hard. While I can see where people could complain that these features make the game too easy, let me say from experience that the game is not easy. Even though you technically have a stamina bar in Wonder Boy, the stamina bar effectively takes the place of a clock, and you have to keep collecting food items to keep that stamina bar up. But stamina is separate from health, and unless you have the skateboard, any hit on you on an enemy or projectile is a one-hit kill. Compounding this issue is whenever you die, you also lose your axes, and being that this game isn't Super Mario Bros., you end up having to avoid everything until you can collect your axes again, which may be a level section or 2 away. I can't imagine trying to play through this entire 40-level game without continuing. I'm sure there are people out there that are crazy enough to attempt it, but in playing the game for the review, there were plenty of times I had to use all 3 of my lives just to make it through one level. All in all, I'm giving Wonder Boy 3 stars. If the control had been just a little tighter, and the majority of the game not subject to one-hit kills, it would be at least a 4-star title and a serious challenger for Super Mario Bros., possibly the superior title of the two. Unfortunately, the game is a bit too difficult for its own good, and as much as I do like it, and as much as I'm impressed by what Sega was able to cram into a 1-megabit title in 1986, I can't go over 3. Platformer fans should definitely give this game a look, and even the US version should be readily available for not too much money, as it's a pre-1988 title.
Okay, that was Wonder Boy. Wonder Boy would become a long-running series, producing another 3 titles on the Master System and 3 titles on the Genesis/Mega Drive. The game series would change vastly from title to title, becoming more of an action RPG series and having its name morph into Monster World, but that's a subject for another video. Also, recently some titles in the series have received high-definition remakes on modern consoles, which is kind of crazy to me, considering the series had laid dormant for 20 years. But I guess you never know when an older game might make a comeback. Tune in next week when I go back into the light gun world, but this time look at a game on the Genesis rather than the Master System that was ported from the arcades and even got its own gun. Remember, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.